Welcome back to Sunday Morning Cafe, our ongoing conversation about what builds and maintains resilience, especially during difficult times. So you've heard that quote from Winston Churchill at the beginning of World War II. England finally wins a battle, and he says to Parliament in a speech, we're not at the end of this thing. In fact, we're not even at the beginning of the end. He said, but perhaps we're at the end of the beginning. Well, at this stage of the game, at this moment, we've just gotten news this week that there are not one but two vaccines that appear to be 95% effective in getting immunity to this pandemic that we're in the middle of, which is an incredible piece of good news. And so I get to say, to use Churchill's quote to say, we're actually glimpsing the beginning of the end. But simultaneously, there's another thing going on, and it's embodied in the words of my wife this morning, who just said, she was sitting on the bed and looking tired, and she said, Tom, I am so tired of this pandemic. My wife works in healthcare, and the way it is that all across our country and in our community, this virus is spiking, and there's some serious overcrowding in our ICUs, and there's more illness, and there's even more death. Those two things going on together remind me of a quote from Robert Frost's poem that goes like this: there's miles to go before I sleep, miles to go before I sleep. And in contemplating those words, I'm reminded of something I got in touch with years ago when I was doing my research to write my dissertation for my PhD. I was interviewing couples who were in the medical residency. One was the medical resident, one was the non-medical spouse. And back in those days, before there was any reform of the residency, it could be pretty brutal. Every fourth night you would work a 30-hour shift, sometimes with no sleep at all. You'd flop in bed that night, wake up the next day for your usual 10 to 12 hours work, until the fourth night when you'd do it again. If you're a surgical resident, maybe every other night you were working 24 hours like that. What I noticed in talking to these couples is they reported a pattern where in the midst of that, they could begin to unconsciously begin to take that out on one another, to kind of scapegoat one another. When they noticed that, my happily married couples, they would resolve to put their shoulder one against the other and to look at the same horizon, and rather than scapegoat one another, to scapegoat the residency. I'd like to take hold of some of that wisdom and apply it to this moment where cases are spiking, and we've had this pandemic pressing down on us now for 7 months. And here we are in that marathon. We've got about 6 more miles to go, which aren't easy miles. And with that pressing down on us, there's a way in which, with this thing pressing down on us, the normal fault lines and fissures that divide us, it has a way of emphasizing those and pressing down. And what we notice is, just like those couples, it's easy to scapegoat one another in all kinds of different ways, whether that's in our society or in our families and marriages. In this moment, applying that wisdom the way they did, rather than scapegoating one another, if we could metaphorically get shoulder to shoulder, face that same horizon and scapegoat what needs to be scapegoated, it's this pandemic we're fighting, not each other. And so rather than passing negative judgments on other, could we pass around a little more grace, a little more understanding of each other? Rather than the reactive defensiveness that's so easy to move toward in relation to one another, can we exercise a kind of humility? I observed that this week in the gym where I've been going swimming here lately. There's a man who's 87 years old who's kind of like my physical role model. He keeps himself as fit as he can. And I watched him in this small enclosure talking to his buddy who was every bit his age, until this guy comes over and he says, Sandy, do you realize we're in an enclosed space and you're not wearing your mask? You know what Sandy did? He said, oh, I'm sorry, you're right. Goes to his locker room, gets his mask, puts it on, and he says, thank you, I'm sorry. And the guy who says it to him says, that's all right, I've got to be reminded too. that kind of humility, that kind of grace to receive that. About a month ago, I'm running through the park here, and I noticed a soccer coach with his big boys gathered together. They're kind of tightly packed, and I watched somebody come over and say, "Hey, coach, some of these kids' parents probably want their kids to be able to still go to school in class. What do you say we separate these kids?" You know what that coach said? "Thanks, I didn't think of that." Rather than like standing his ground and being tough in front of his team, he goes, "You're right, let's separate out here." Again, look at that grace. At 6 more miles in the marathon, willing to exercise that kind of grace. Don't get me wrong, I totally agree with my wife. I'm tired of this pandemic. My favorite holiday of the year is Thanksgiving. I love nothing more than to prepare a big feast for my extended family. From the appetizers through the turkey and the fixings all the way to the pie. I'm not a bad chef at that, and I love to gather people like that. I can't do that with my extended family this year. In fact, not all of my nuclear family can get together this year. It's pretty dark. But what I have to remember is that I can still feed the people in my life. I can feed them with this knowledge, that it's always darkest before the dawn. And so what can I feed them with? On my Zoom calls that we're going to get together with, I can feed people with words of encouragement. I can feed people with the kind of hope that says this: "So you're grieving because my friend Ray's dad died of COVID." I can feed him with the kind of hope where I can bear with him in his grief. I can feed myself hope by bearing with myself, accepting the emotion that's there and letting it pass through me. There is a light on the horizon right now. It's time for us to see that light, like when you wake up in the morning before the sunrise and you just see that line beginning to form. It's time right now to strengthen our weary hands and our unsteady legs, to strengthen those now, to brush back up on those skills that have gotten us this far, that can take us the rest of the way. If it's helpful to you, to go to my website, sundaymorningcafe.com, click on that pandemic toolkit I put together, the Resilience Toolkit, and you'll find 15 pages with videos embedded in that you can just brush up and see where are the skills that you can recommit yourself to get through the last part of this journey together. I'd like to draw up the image of that movie Apollo 13. I'm old enough to remember when it was actually happening, where that spaceship that was trying to get to the moon for another moonwalk got disabled. And they were able to generate just enough power to shoot themselves into orbit around the dark side of the moon so that they could swing out with that gravitational pull and be slungshot back to Earth out into the light. It seems to me we're on that journey right now, but we're on the dark side of the moon, and we can see that our plan is to be swung back out into the light. I'd like us to imagine what it'll be like to be back out into the light. And from that vantage point of being in that light again, I'd like us to imagine looking back to this time when we're on this dark side of the moon. What is it that gave us hope when we were here and now is what I want us to ask ourselves when we're back out in the light, which is to say, what are those things that we can speak to one another to nurture the hope of what's to come? And so that's our conversation for this week. I hope this will be a conversation you're able to pass around in your Thanksgiving meals, whether it's on Zoom or with the few people you can gather with. And I'll see you next week to discuss more on what it means to be resilient during this stage of our journey.